We want to welcome you to a mirror of our culture, sport and society in America. We're proud to be co-hosts of this extraordinary conference, which we're so pleased to have all of you with us today, tomorrow, and Friday as well. It's my pleasure to introduce to you now President Thomas Kunkel. Tom is completing his second year as president at St. Norbert College. Prior to his appointment here, he served for 8 years as the dean of the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland, one of the nation's top journalism programs. He also served as president of the American Journalism Review, a national magazine published by the college. Prior to becoming dean, President Kunkel had served as director of the Maryland's Knight Center for Specialized Journalism and as editor and director of the project on the state of the American newspaper. A writer and editor, he worked for a number of different newspapers in his time, the New York Times, the Miami Herald, the Cincinnati Post, just to name a few of them. He's the author or editor of 5 books. It's my pleasure to present to you President Thomas Kunkel.
Well, on behalf of St. Norbert College, let me add my welcome to all of you. Back in 1958, the Green Bay Packers decided to move their summer training camp to our campus. They had a new coach, Scooter McLean. Unfortunately for Scooter, he lasted just that one season, as the Packers that year went 1-10-1. But it was not St. Norbert's fault. And we can prove it. A new guy arrived the following season, Vince Lombardi. He loved the campus, he loved the Norbertine fathers, he loved President Father Burke, and he would go on to win a lot. Over the next 9 years, Lombardi's Packers won 5 NFL championships, including the first 2 Super Bowls. More than a half century after it began, the Packers and St. Norbert College have the longest-running training camp partnership in the NFL, something we are extremely proud of. And in that vein, we are simply thrilled to have the Packers co-sponsoring this first-of-its-kind symposium on sports and society. I especially want to thank Mark Murphy and Betsy Mitchell of the Packers for their enthusiastic support for the idea and their hard work in pulling it together. Everyone who's paying half attention understands that the importance of sports in our culture far transcends what happens on the playing fields. Of course, many of you in the hall today have devoted much or most of your careers to researching and writing about those implications. That's why we're so pleased to have you with us for what we feel will be a unique and uniquely entertaining venue for exploring this complex subject. I want to thank my colleague Mike Marsden for conceiving this idea and urging us to propose it to the Packer organization. And I especially want to thank Dr. Kevin Quinn, our Associate Dean for Social Sciences, for planning and coordinating the program. Sports and society is a big, big subject. And as you'll see from your program, our symposium is going to cover a very broad waterfront, from sports and race to the impact of sports on our local, regional, and national economies, to sports as depicted in film, to the sports hero as role model. And though there will be plenty of academic presentations, I promise you this is definitely not going to be your father's academic symposium, or your mother's for that matter. Now, to get us started by introducing the morning's keynote speaker, it's my great pleasure to welcome the President and CEO of the Green Bay Packers, Mr. Mark Murphy. Mark is heading into the 3rd season with the Packers, a position that is the capstone of a long and distinguished career along the way. See, you jumped to conclusions there, Mark. Sorry about that. A graduate of Colgate University, Mark was an all-pro safety in an 8-year career with the Washington Redskins. He went on to get a law degree and an MBA, serving as a trial attorney with the Justice Department, assistant executive director of the NFL Players Association, and athletic director of Colgate and Northwest Universities. In addition to being responsible for all the on- and off-field operations for the Packers, Mark also serves on the NFL's Management Council Executive Committee, which is responsible for negotiating a new collective bargaining agreement with the Players Association. I'd also like to tell you that Mark and his wife Laurie already have made a very big impact in the Green Bay community as well. Now, please join me in welcoming Mr. Mark Murphy.
It is a pleasure to be here, and I want to, on behalf of the Green Bay Packers, welcome all of you to this conference. And also I want to thank both Tom and Mike for approaching us. We are very proud of our relationship with St. Norbert, and we're really excited to be co-sponsors of this event. This is, we think, something that's very unique across the country and really special to this community, so we're happy to be a part of it and really enjoy our relationship with St. Norbert. As you said, it goes back many years, and obviously the training camp, but this is another strong way for us to connect, and really pleased to do that. My main purpose here today is to introduce Paul Tagliabue. Really a remarkable man, and just want to say a few words about him before I turn it over to Paul. But something a lot of people don't know about Paul, I think most people think, well, former commissioner, he was a lawyer. Paul was an elite athlete. He was a great athlete. We were talking a little bit earlier. Tremendous basketball player in Jersey City. Actually was a state high jump champion in Jersey City, and then went on, had a basketball scholarship, played 4 years basketball at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Actually, he was their all-time rebounding leader until Georgetown, a young man by the name of Patrick Ewing went to Georgetown and broke a few of Paul's records. But so when you talk about sport and society and the impact that athletics has in society, Paul's seen it from many different perspectives. I first met Paul when he was a fairly young attorney with a law firm in Washington, D.C., Covington and Burling. He was also, while he was with Covington, was special counsel to the league, did all kinds of things with the league and actually other sports-related clients. But quickly, I learned what an outstanding attorney and great person Paul was. Did a lot of different things for the league, and then when Commissioner Pete Rozelle left the league in the or late 1980s, Paul was chosen as commissioner, and Paul served as commissioner of the NFL for 17 years and just did a phenomenal job, and is really probably the main reason that the NFL is enjoying the great success that it is now. Probably, I think without question, the strongest and most powerful and most influential professional sports league in the country, and that really primarily is due to Paul's great work. Among Paul's accomplishments, negotiated the highest TV contracts ever on behalf of the NFL, helped expand the league from 28 to 32 teams. One of the things that Paul was really helpful with is moving teams forward in terms of building new stadiums and renovating stadiums. 20 out of the 32 teams built new stadiums or renovated stadiums during Paul's tenure. And one of the big ones that we certainly appreciate here is the renovation of Lambeau Field. That was also due in large part to Paul's fine work at the league level. But what he's probably best known for, though, is the tremendous labor peace that the league enjoyed under his tenure as commissioner. To put it in perspective, and it's a little easier for me because I lived during that. I was a player during and worked for the Players Association during that time. Throughout the 80s, the labor relations between the management and the players were bad during the 80s. 1982, we had a 9-week strike. 1987, there was a 3-week strike, and Paul came in 2 years after that. And during that time period, there was no collective bargaining agreement. The players had started to file an antitrust suit. And Paul quickly looked at the situation and decided, we need to reach an agreement and we need to reach a partnership with the players. And one of the things that Paul did, and at the time it was risky, but he established a tremendous working relationship with Gene Upshaw. And really since then, we've had tremendous labor peace. The first agreement was reached in 1993, and that labor peace continues until today. But obviously now we're in a situation where, and I'm sure Paul will touch on it, we're into our last year of our collective bargaining agreement, but we're all really hopeful that we can, as Paul did, establish a good working relationship and reach an agreement that works for the players, the owners, and allows us to grow the game. Paul retired in 2006, and those of you that know Paul know that he's an active man and has continued to be involved in athletics and sports. He's involved in a couple different boards of higher education boards with the SUNY system in New York, and he's also the chairman of the Board of Trustees at Georgetown. In addition, he's worked on a special committee with the United States Olympic Committee, and also now works as a special advisor to the Big East Athletic Conference. So he's seen sport and society from all different perspectives. He's a fascinating man, one of the most thoughtful and intelligent people that I've ever met, and it's really a treat and a pleasure for me to introduce today our keynote speaker, Paul Tagliabue.
Well, thank you, Mark, and I hope I can live up to everyone's expectations. When Mark was the AD at Colgate, I got an honorary degree at Colgate. You didn't mention that. Everything else you went over. Obviously, the subject that I have today, sport in American society, is not only critically important, but it's a little bit intimidating in many ways. The scope and the variety of topics that you're going to be addressing is almost remarkable, and many of your subjects are very provocatively defined. They have far-reaching implications, not just for sport, but for society at large beyond sport. I've been introduced today as the former commissioner of the National Football League, and this is fine, especially here in Packer country. Being anything to do with the NFL carries a great deal of respect and significance. But I must say that whenever you're introduced as the former anything, it can be a bit disturbing because it may imply that you're looking at life through a rear-view mirror, and I will try to avoid doing that. Although once the commissioner of the NFL, it is really basketball that was my sport as a youngster. Basketball was my forte, the sport in which I was able to compete very successfully, and it's where I proved to myself and to others that I really was an athlete. But basketball, more importantly, was also the sport that enabled me to be a highly recruited high school athlete, to secure a scholarship to go to Georgetown as a student athlete. And because I was able to go to Georgetown, I attained a very high quality education. On top of that, I was able to go to law school on an academic scholarship and then to be well educated to compete in the real world. So from my perspective, basketball is what says a lot to me about how amateur sport in America can shape its participants. But come back to football for a moment, because my experience there, I think, also says a lot about the place of sport in American society. Frequently I'm told, especially since I retired, that I became well known in America partly because my name was affixed on the NFL's Wilson football and people could see my signature on television. So I've got two footballs here with me, and the first one is the Wilson football. It's usually all leather. This is what they call a white panel job, but it's got my signature on there. So that, in some ways, was significant for me in my career. But for me, the really important football is another one that I have up here. It's a kind of street football that we used in Jersey City, New Jersey, when I was a kid in the early 50s, playing touch football. It's a football made of newspaper. The newspaper is wrapped tight in what we then called black electrical tape. I'll show you this version of a football. That is a football in Jersey City from the 50s. Now, you could make it more elaborately. You can build it up in the middle. You can put more tape on the end. And it's wrapped in black electrical tape. And if you want to throw it, you can actually figure out how to throw a spiral.
That's why there are no NFL players in Jersey City.
Yeah. See, 3 of my high school basketball teammates actually played in the NFL. But in an immigrant neighborhood after World War II, there was not a lot of spare change to spend on sporting equipment. I can guarantee you that. So we didn't have footballs. At least we didn't have rubber or leather inflated footballs that we were able to use in the street. If you had a football that was inflated, you could use it on dirt or grass so it wouldn't get scuffed and wear a hole in it. If you're playing in the street or in the schoolyard, you had to use that. You could replace it very easily. Go home, get another newspaper, get some more tape, make another football. But the key thing, I think, was that with that kind of a football, we pretended that we were, you know, Doc Blanchard, Glenn Davis. We pretended that we were playing for West Point. Those guys had been the greatest football players of the World War II years, so you would think and dream about where you could go with sport. So this type of football, this type of sport, you know, also tells us that sport in America, for many, many people, at least in the last century, was a way to connect with America's institutions and to go up and out of an immigrant community into mainstream America. My own experiences, I think, in sport are, you know, parochial, but they're shared by many in 20th century America. Take, for example, the late Supreme Court Justice Byron Whizzer White. Justice White, in the late 30s, early 40s, was the greatest college football player in America. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He studied law at Yale while he was playing in the NFL for the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Detroit Lions. He was the highest paid player in the NFL while he was studying law at Yale. And when he went to the Supreme Court in the early 60s, appointed by President Kennedy, he talked about his experiences in sport, and he put it this way. He said, while athletics are a manufactured environment, there comes that moment when you stand face to face with doing. The moment, perhaps a fraction of a second, comes when you either do or you don't. And then he continued, he said, this kind of experience is valuable in maturing one. It contributes to one's self-reliance, initiative, and integrity. And then he added, it's damn good fun, which is not to be sneezed at. So as I look at my own experience and experiences of people like Byron White, I recognize that it's somewhat parochial, and more importantly, that my experiences and his do not touch upon the defining societal issues addressed in amateur and professional sports in the last century. Those were issues of gender and race, symbolized by Jackie Robinson's playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers in Major League Baseball in 1947 and beyond, and by the enactment of Title IX in 1972, accelerating the participation of women in sports. Now, with respect to race, as a kid growing up in New Jersey, but with dozens of cousins living in Brooklyn, I grew up as a rabid Dodger fan, idolizing Jackie Robinson, other African-American athletes, Don Newcomb, Roy Campanella, pioneers in breaking the color line in baseball. But in my own athletic experience, growing up in that immigrant environment, I cannot recall playing with or against an African-American athlete until the tail end of my high school years, which were 1957 and 58. Seems astounding to me today that so many things changed so quickly, beginning with the Supreme Court's decision on Brown versus the Board of Education in 54, the Civil Rights Act of 64, Title IX in 72. So many things changed so rapidly, but my own experience in the 50s was still in that little cocoon following World War II. So I'm going to return to issues of gender and race later on. To discuss sport and society, which is your challenge here this week, to discuss those subjects intelligently, I think you have to start by focusing on the very many different meanings of sport. There are many dimensions of sport. I can only mention a few and really can't discuss most of them in detail. But we all recognize, I think, at least implicitly, and it's helpful to do it explicitly, that sport can be many different things for different people in different contexts, not just in America, but around the globe. Obviously, we start with the fact sport is athletic competition, and it's important to keep that focus. Equally obvious, sport is a learning experience. It's about character. It's about qualities that enable you to succeed in life if you participate in sport in the right way. In short, sport can be a real education that can carry you way beyond the athletic field. The Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, who himself played basketball at Harvard, recently said in a speech to the NC2A, quote, "I'm passionate about sports because I'm convinced that when priorities are in order, there is no better way to teach invaluable life lessons than on the playing field or the court." At some point, sport quickly becomes entertainment, and entertainment frequently becomes commercial. So at that level, sport becomes ultimately a business issue with business dimensions. Then you have issues of sport in terms of mass participation and sport involving elite athletes, amateur sport, grassroots sport versus professional sport. They involve many, many different considerations, as I learned when I was working recently for the U.S. Olympic Committee. We can also consider sport from the perspective of participants and participation versus sport from the perspective of the spectator, the consumer. And my own feeling is that that's a critically important pivot point today as we more and more live in an online world. We more and more have virtual experiences, and perhaps less and less have experiences that in some contexts are called bricks and mortar. In this context, probably called the hardwood and the grass. So whether you're playing sport or watching sport or just talking about sport rather than doing sport, you can have many different perspectives. Sport's also a critical manifestation of community, and that's not known any better than in this community here in Green Bay, where the Packers for so many years, so many decades, have been a critical part of community. The NFL, sometimes we used to say our product was the triple C's: competition, collaboration through the league, and community. And a striking example of the community manifestations of sport occurred in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, with the decision that the Saints would stay there and that the Superdome would be rebuilt as a way of contributing to the hoped-for rebirth of that community. With the collective will of thousands of people, with a lot of leadership from many people, the Superdome was rebuilt. The Saints resumed playing 1 year after Katrina, and that was followed by extraordinary efforts by Saints players and coaches in that community, Sean Payton, Drew Brees, and many others. In February, almost as if in a dream, the Saints won the Super Bowl, and the city seemed to be resurrected. The Saints brought home not just the Lombardi Trophy, but they underscored that the age-old lesson that in many, many dimensions and at its essence, team sports are about community. When people ask me about sports and society, I usually like to think about some of the more provocative and out-of-the-box assessments. And one of my favorites is by a professor of American foreign policy at Johns Hopkins, Michael Mandelbaum. The book is entitled The Meaning of Sports: Why Americans Watch Baseball, Football, and Basketball, and What They See When They Do. It's a terrific book based on a historical review. It takes into account anthropology. It closely examines the development of America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the movement from the rural to the urban. And Professor Mandelbaum finds deep religious roots for sports. He says that sports' powerful grip on the imagination of Americans, it has its source ultimately in human needs that can be traced back to the earliest human communities, needs to which the dominant response for most of human history came from organized religion. This is really a well-argued book and well worth reading, but here's how he puts his point about sports and religion. He says, quote, "Sports and organized religion share several important features. Both address the needs of the spirit and the psyche rather than the needs of the flesh. Neither bears directly on what is necessary. Both stand outside the working world. And team sports provide three satisfactions of life to 20th century Americans that before the modern age only religion offered: a welcome diversion from the routines of daily life, a model of coherence and clarity, and heroic examples to admire and emulate." The other end of the spectrum, there's been a lot of talk about sport, especially football, that recurred throughout the last century on one simple question. Is football mostly about violence, indeed about war, or is football more benign, and might it actually be a substitute for war or other destructive forms of engagement? Over the years, some people have pointed to the terminology of football. I'm sure Mark was, as he played for the Redskins, some of this was current at his time. The terminology of football was often criticized. Blitzes, which comes from the blitzkrieg. Battles in the trenches, the forward pass referred to as the long bomb. Others note that the founder of college football, Yale's Walter Camp, often sprinkled comparisons to warfare in his arguments for how football should be played and for the importance of football. And many grew up in the last century to recite from memory General MacArthur's observation, quote, "Upon the fields of friendly strife are sown seeds that upon other fields on other days will bear the fruits of victory." And you have similar statements from Churchill and others in England about competition in sports in England. In the 60s and early 70s, when I was first involved with sports as an attorney, America was at war in Vietnam, and NFL football at that time, and I think this is reflected in one or two of the topics on your agenda for this week. Football was often associated with war and political leaders who were viewed as pro-war, partly for the silly reason that President Nixon reportedly used to call the Redskins coach George Allen and suggest plays to be run by the Redskins, so football became a part of Nixon's war planning. Personally, I never found such arguments very persuasive, and when I became commissioner, a professor of literature and poetry at Bates College, who happened to be my cousin, wrote a poem dedicated to me that saw football as a substitute for violent aggression. My cousin told me when I became commissioner he only knew one other person in his life who was involved in sports, and that was Babe Ruth. And as he concluded his statement to me, he said, "And I don't think he was in football, but I'm not sure." Anyway, my cousin wrote this poem. It's a wonderful piece. He talks about football as involving, quote, "momentary mountains of costumed beefy men, helmeted like Greek warriors, competing in snow and rain or brilliant sun and wind in fall and winter." You can identify with that up here. And then he concluded, "Sometimes, battered and boisterous, they kick, they run, they catch, audiences wildly applaud, and we all win when we turn wars into exuberances of sport." So the role of sport in America is not just complex, it can be debated from a lot of different perspectives. The media today features culture wars, and sport itself has its own culture wars, its own battlegrounds of values, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, the heroic and the shameful, often played out with stereotypes. I think in your discussions here this week, be interesting and constructive to seek to identify different traditions in American culture and to consider whether they are complementary or conflicting. Perhaps you can reconcile or combine those that may be conflicting into a coherent vision and a set of principles that would produce a respected and valued framework for leadership and action by individuals and organizations who embrace the societal importance of sports. We have, for example, a sport tradition of excelling and winning, individually or as a team, and for the community. Sometimes the winning is said to be at all costs, and Coach Lombardi is often seen as the embodiment of this tradition. At the same time, just to take another example, we have a civil rights tradition of giving individuals the opportunity to participate fully and without discrimination in all aspects of society and to serve others in the community as a higher calling. And Dr. Martin Luther King is often seen as the embodiment of this tradition. So they were contemporaries, but two quite different people. Can these traditions be blended and synthesized? Should they be? Would this serve any useful purpose in sport or beyond? Both traditions rest on the power of ideas and on views of human nature that have been well articulated. Both traditions rest on the power of leaders and movements, on the actions of men and women who have been leaders and doers with ideas that inspired and motivated millions of citizens. So I started to think about this, and let me just share a perspective. In David Moranis' biography of Coach Lombardi, entitled When Pride Still Mattered, he tells us that a key element in Coach Lombardi's search for meaning was about striving for perfection. That Lombardi's Jesuit mentors at Fordham University, quote, taught him that human perfection was unattainable, but that all human beings should still work toward perfection by using their God-given capacity to the fullest. And, as Lombardi put it, the spirit to excel should endure forever. And Moranis quotes Lombardi as follows: complete victory can never be won. It must be pursued, it must be wooed with all of one's might. Each week there is a new encounter, each year there is a new challenge. But all of the display, all of the noise, all of the glamour, and all of the color and the excitement, they exist only in the memory. But the spirit, the will to excel, the will to win, they endure, they last forever. These are the qualities, I think, that are larger and more important than any of the events that occasion them. 50 years ago, Dr. King, as I said, a Lombardi contemporary, but obviously from a very different background and with a different mission, emphasized also the spirit. He talked about conduct that can enrich our spirit in special ways. And he said, and I'll quote this, whatever career you may choose for yourself, doctor, lawyer, teacher, let me propose an avocation to be pursued along with it. Become a dedicated fighter for civil rights. Make it a central part of your life. It will make you a better doctor, a better lawyer, a better teacher. It will enrich your spirit as nothing else possibly can. It will give you that rare sense of nobility that can only spring from love and selflessly helping your fellow man. Make a career of humanity. You will make a greater person of yourself, a greater nation of your country, and a finer world to live in. So make a career of humanity. That is Dr. King's message to all us. And the focus on this enriching the spirit and pursuing perfection, even if you fail, is something common to both Dr. King and Coach Lombardi. There are many, many ways authentic to our own interests, our own training, and our own activities to make a career of humanity and to pursue excellence. Take, for example, the world of athletics, where participation in sports is an intensive education, as I've already suggested. Some of the greatest teachers that we can all look at, some of our greatest mentors, have made a career of humanity through their careers in athletics. I'm thinking, for example, of Eddie Robinson, who began coaching college football in the early 40s at Grambling, went on to win more than 400 games in his career, sent many great Grambling players, including the Packers' great Willie Davis, to the NFL, and broke down stereotypes that stopped so many African-American men before Robinson from getting even the chance to coach or play football at the highest levels. I'm thinking of Penn State football coach Joe Paterno, who liked to tell his players what the poet Robert Browning had written: a man's reach should exceed his grasp. Paterno understood that you cannot succeed on the football field or in life unless you are never self-satisfied, always reaching higher. His legacy includes not just exceptional graduation rates for his players, but endowed faculty positions and library facilities at Penn State. I'm thinking of Wilma Rudolph, who became in the 1960 Olympics the first U.S. woman track athlete to win 3 gold medals. She became a hero to American women and girls of all backgrounds, a symbol of the moral imperative of ensuring equal opportunity to women and girls in sport. After the Olympics, celebrating her victories in her hometown, she declared, quote, in every effort, I've been motivated by one thing, to do justice to those who believe in me and to use my physical talents to the glory of God and the honor of womanhood. I'm thinking of the baseball player Roberto Clemente, Hall of Famer for the Pirates. Born into poverty in Puerto Rico, Clemente valued both his roots and his opportunities in American sport. After a devastating earthquake in Nicaragua, he chartered a plane to deliver supplies himself. The aircraft crashed soon after takeoff, and he died just a few miles from his birthplace. His devotion to humanity serves as an inspiration to many. As he once put it, anytime you have an opportunity to make a difference and you don't do it, you are wasting your time on earth. I'm thinking of Billie Jean King, an extraordinary professional tennis player for more than 2 decades, beginning in the 60s, a leader in the creation of the first women's professional tennis tour, and an early, effective advocate for the rights of women and the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community, and against sexism and homophobia in sports and society. And finally, as I look at the 20th century, I'm thinking of someone I know very well, someone I played against when I was a freshman in college, John Thompson, the very talented basketball coach for 27 seasons at my alma mater, Georgetown. John knew that college athletics have a special value for students from lower income communities because it can give them otherwise unavailable access to higher education. By walking off the court before 2 games in 1989, John galvanized coaches and university presidents around the country to revoke an NCAA proposal that he and they ultimately viewed as discriminatory in limiting access to athletic scholarships. Each of these figures has had a catalyzing effect on society, has moved the needle for social justice by these individuals excelling not just in sports, but in vocations beyond sports that made a large social impact. As you reflect upon the stories of these leaders, of Eddie Robinson, Joe Paterno, Wilma Rudolph, Roberto Clemente, Billie Jean King, and John Thompson, I think you can see that many of the sports icons of the last century made for themselves, as Dr. King put it, careers of humanity in sports. So in many, many ways, I think the critical question we all face going forward is whether in the next century, the 21st century, this century, we can continue to produce such leaders. Men and women with the spirit to excel, as Lombardi put it, and motivated to enrich the spirit, as Dr. King put it. Will sports continue to be a positive force in developing the qualities and experiences that create athlete citizens? Do we have the institutions and the resources committed to create environments in which such sports leaders can grow and thrive? I must say I'm often amazed and usually dismayed at the numbers of talented young people that I meet whose only career interests are in sports business, sports event management, or sports marketing. Not enough of them talk to me about sports leadership, coaching, and other aspects of sport that go beyond the business sphere. Do we need more academic programs in our colleges and universities offering degrees in coaching as a form of teaching, offering degrees in sports leadership, if not degrees, at least programs and majors? Can our colleges and our universities deliver on Secretary Duncan's observation in his recent speech to the NC2A, where he said, collectively, along with the military, college sports are arguably the most important and largest developer of young men's and women's character in the nation. You are literally creating our nation's future leaders. As I look over the horizon into the next century, the heart of our overall challenge as a nation will continue to be the global leader in all areas. This will include leadership in sports and in those areas of societal endeavor in which sports leaders in the last century contributed enormously. But do we as a society recognize the urgency of the continuing need to make leadership in sports a national priority? The global competition that our young people are entering is radically different from the world that prior generations of America's young people entered. You can read about it every day. In most areas of amateur and professional sports today, there's a global talent pool, not just of athletes, but of leaders in other aspects of sport. And it's a talent pool that's meeting standards that others outside of the United States are increasingly setting. We all need to make it a priority to understand this new world and to prepare our young people to compete and lead in it. Recently, as Mark mentioned, I chaired an advisory committee for the U.S. Olympic Committee, and our committee's report recognized that an ever larger cohort of nations participates now in international sports competitions, often with government funding far beyond our own government funding, competing effectively across the board in Olympic sports. We also recognize that our U.S. Olympians and Paralympians must succeed in this environment in the face of difficult economic and financial constraints in the United States right now, and perhaps going forward. Our committee's report also emphasized that youth sports throughout the United States operate in extremely competitive conditions, and that these organizations in many cases are now facing very difficult financial circumstances. Others have raised similar red flags of warning or of deep concern. There's an important report issued earlier this year, which is being shared with the White House, suggesting that American youth sports are in serious decline and that opportunities to play are decreasing and becoming more costly, particularly with the rapid growth of participation fees to play sports, so-called pay-to-play fees in schools of all types, including public schools. In addition, budget cuts to school sports programs in the past several years alone, since the financial crisis hit, have exceeded $2 billion in public schools around the country, according to this report. This research also focuses on the significant long-term costs to society if state and local governments were to continue to cut funding for youth sports, including associated costs of health care for obesity-related illnesses and others, criminal law enforcement costs, and the economic consequences of high school dropout rates. So one thing I think is certain: the need for leadership by all of us in sports is not to diminish. To the contrary, it's likely to increase dramatically. And for me, the positive thing is that a next generation of leaders exists, but we need to support them and expand their ranks. I'll give you a few examples. We could all do well to support leaders such as Ann Cody, a three-time Paralympian in track and field and basketball, a world record holder, and a marathoner who inspires and serves the cause of athletes with disabilities in the United States and worldwide in key positions in the U.S. and international Paralympic movements. Ann's commitment to working collaboratively with the poor around the world is helping to empower disabled women previously forgotten. We would all do well to support leaders such as Dikembe Mutombo, the former outstanding Georgetown and NBA basketball player, born and raised in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, whose tireless dedication to helping others has, among other things, resulted in the construction of the first new research and teaching hospital in the Congo in nearly 40 years, with a personal donation of over $15 million by Mr. Mutombo. The hospital is named after his mother. We would all do well to support leaders such as Warrick Dunn, a recently retired outstanding NFL player, now a part owner, I understand, of the Atlanta Falcons. Warrick Dunn became the head of his own family when he was 18 years old, when his mother, an off-duty police officer was killed by armed robbers. Since then, he's focused his considerable charitable efforts in helping almost 100 single-parent families obtain first-time home ownership, establishing productive environments for them to thrive educationally, socially, and economically. We would all do well to support leaders such as Brian Burke, the general manager of the NHL's Toronto Maple Leafs hockey team, Team USA's men's hockey general manager in the Vancouver Olympics. Brian Burke recently lost his gay son in a tragic automobile accident. Brian's committed himself to educational programs to eliminate the bullying of gay children and to help reduce and eventually eliminate homophobic attitudes and discriminatory practices in sports. And we would all do well to support another leader that I had the privilege of meeting in my USOC work, Angela Ruggiero, four-time Olympic ice hockey player, Harvard graduate, medal winner 4 times, recently elected during the Vancouver Olympics as an athlete's representative to the International Olympic Committee, committing herself to strengthened international cooperation in sports and creating opportunities around the globe for young and often impoverished people. So I think while there's a cause for concern, there's also cause for optimism if we understand what leadership is. As we go forward with responsibilities for sports in America, I think we can take our lead from the values, the spirit to excel, and the vision, maybe the 2 visions or 1 vision of Coach Lombardi and Dr. King. All of us must make it our highest priority, our moral imperative, to energize and support leaders such as those I've mentioned, and just as important, to support the visions they articulate, the institutions they create, the programs they formulate, the resources they generate, and the legions that they motivate. So hopefully that'll give you some goals for this week and some food for thought. Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening. Godspeed.
The Commissioner has agreed to take questions. We have time. If you have a question, if you would rise and identify yourself for the Commissioner, that would be helpful, and then speak as loudly as possible. Thank you.
Let's see. Question. Mark. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing in the Big East, particularly as it relates to conference expansion, the school we're looking at now.
Yeah, basically it grew out of my chairing the board of directors at Georgetown, and the president of Georgetown first asked me to talk with him and some of his people about where the Big East might go as there's more and more discussion in college sports about bigger and bigger conferences and conferences that have television networks and lots of television revenue from football. And the Big East, of course, has got half of its schools play football, half of its schools don't. Their main sport is basketball. And then from those Georgetown conversations, I've ended up as a volunteer sort of advising the Big East commissioner and the Big East presidents. And, I think the issues are, they're challenging because on the one hand, there's a need for revenue, there's a need for funding for sports, television revenue for football, and to a lesser degree basketball is the funder of many of the intercollegiate sports across the board. Georgetown participates in more intercollegiate sports, I think, than any other Big East school. You know some of these issues from your days at Colgate and Northwestern. So the funding is important, especially at a time when endowments are flagging, philanthropy is flagging, tuition increases are being held down. On the other hand, you have to keep the focus on the academic priorities of the university. You have to keep sports in context. You have to resist the pressures just to keep adding product, adding weeks. So it's a complicated set of issues, both commercial and academic issues. And I guess my piece is really in the media space, how to create value for conferences in this case, without sacrificing the other values that universities need to preserve. It's going to be an interesting piece of work. I'm only dismayed that it's going to be too intensive during the summer months when I was hoping to spend a lot of time on an island in Maine. Question over here? I guess the first thing I would say is that it might have had that impact on Bear Bryant, but there were so many things that happened for so many years. I think one of the great stories goes back to some of the NFL Hall of Famers who played for the University of San Francisco. I think Ollie Matson and people like that, who in the early 50s refused to go play a bowl game because they wouldn't let the black athletes play in that bowl game. So I think most of those things happen incrementally and over time. There are dramatic moments we all remember, but I think to some extent those are symbols, and symbols aren't always in sync with reality. Going forward, I think ownership, minority ownership, is going to be a critical thing in sports. Having university officials who are university presidents and board members, and not just football and basketball coaches like Eddie Robinson and John Thompson, I think is going to be critical. So people will move on to people with different experiences, minorities and women and others. We'll move on to positions of leadership. I think those things will be very important. As I suggested in my remarks, I think a greater understanding of the needs of our disabled, greater understanding of our gay and lesbian community and people in those areas, I think is important. So, but in many ways, probably the biggest challenge has to do with the gap between the haves and the have-nots, because in many areas, it's pretty clear that the resources going into sport and to leadership in sport, when the right kinds of sport experiences are available in those communities that are relatively well off in terms of income and quality of life, and the people in our society who are getting shortchanged or at the lower end of the economic scale, where they depend on public education, and in a lot of areas those programs are being gutted, and that includes people, groups in society have been here for decades, and also includes new immigrant groups. So in many ways, I think that economic issue is the biggest challenge, and people who can lead in that area are going to be critical. And I think Secretary Duncan understands that, but it's not something that just the public sector can deal with. I think all of us in universities and other institutions, NGOs, need to keep putting the pressure on for participation in sports in the right ways. There's a question down here.
I was going to ask you, what's the biggest threat that you see to leadership in sport, and if you will, leadership in society?
Yeah, it's what I've alluded to. I think it starts with that haves and have-nots. We're going to have to make a lot of choices because we have lots of issues facing us: healthcare, education, sports. So that's why I say I think it can't all be government. It's got to be a lot of community leadership, a lot of leadership from educational institutions and NGOs, and You know, in some ways it's about recognizing what I tried to do this morning, recognize those leaders in sports, those icons who had a tremendous impact beyond sports, and keep our focus on that, and not just on the commercial aspect of it, and you know, not just on the entertainment aspect of it. Fantasy football is great, but we need a hell of a lot more people worried about things in sports other than fantasy football.
What do you see as the threat to leadership taking that step to do those things?
Yeah, I don't think there's enough of a focus on just talking about leadership, understanding what leadership is, understanding how you create opportunities to lead. Leadership is a complicated thing, and I know in my own case, sometimes it takes decades to really understand how you can create opportunities to lead. At Georgetown, there's an interesting conversation going on. I'm sure Georgetown's not unique, where they're talking about a leadership academy for student athletes, in which a component of the curriculum or an extracurricular component for student athletes would be about leadership. What is it? Give us examples, young and old. And I don't think, you know, in the business community, if you look at the Harvard Business Review, every month it's about leadership. The books about leadership, there are dozens of them every year, and some of them are great, some of them are less useful. I don't see that in sports. Why not? It's not something that, to some extent you're born to lead, maybe. Certainly Vince Lombardi and Dr. King were born to lead, but it's also about acquiring skills and understanding how to mobilize, create organizations. There's a new group out there called Up to Us. UP, the number 2, us. They get it. There need to be more organizations like that focused on leadership in sports. And, and I think, like I said, Secretary Duncan, I think, gets it. President Kennedy had the President's Council on Physical Fitness. Well, that was great in 1960, but, should there be the President's Council on Leadership in Sports? And if there is, what should it be? And how do you take this commercial engine that's out there in sports, which includes the colleges and universities, not just the professionals, and give it more impact in society than it has had to date? People are working on it, but we're not there yet. I think we need to keep working harder, and we need to commit more resources to it.
Yes, Commissioner, in light of you being an attorney and Commissioner of the National Football League, any thoughts on the Supreme Court's decision earlier this week?
One of the things I decided when I went to the NFL, I would no longer be an attorney, and I haven't read a court decision in 25 years. In fact, it's very hard even to get me to read a summary of a court's decision. So I think the most prudent thing would not to be saying anything about it, because I haven't read it and I haven't read a summary of it. I haven't even read newspaper stories about it. I just don't know enough to speak intelligently on the subject. 20 years ago, I could have spoken for 2 hours on the subject, but I know that's not what you want, and plus I have to catch a plane. I guess the only thing I do know is that it never would have had any effect on the labor negotiations, and it's a completely different issue from labor. So in terms of the big priority for the league, that whole court case was irrelevant.
Mr. Commissioner, thank you for being with us here in Green Bay today. My name is Robert Hankwitz. Question for you. A reflection of our society is the financial challenges. You touched on that briefly. In order for a team or an individual to make an impact in sports, they have to take the field. With the news recently of the Texas Rangers filing for bankruptcy protection, a number of NBA teams that are supposedly on financially shaky ground It was even said that in the NFL, teams like the Jacksonville Jaguars may not have good financial stability. Do you think in this era of financial challenges that we are going to see teams or maybe even entire leagues for main sports, not other leagues, but of the four main sports, where they will just contract or maybe even go away?
I don't think so. I think they have to figure out how to reallocate their resources. You know, we had a boom economy driven by lots of different things, including technology, the internet, unfortunate leverage and financing, and lots of other things. So we need, and plus we're competing with nations around the world who are going to outcompete us for various reasons. In some cases, they have lower cost wage structures. In other cases, they're working harder with science and technology. So we're going to have to readjust a lot of our organizational and institutional economics. But if you have an NFL with $7 or $8 billion of revenue, an NBA with revenue that's a big fraction of that, baseball close to the NFL, you shouldn't be talking about bankruptcy. You should be talking about reallocating your resources. And a part of that reallocation should be to these kinds of issues. Mark and I were talking earlier. I think he was on the board of something we created in the NFL in the last decade called the Youth Football Fund, where we put a couple of $100 million with agreement from the Players Association into youth sports over a period of years. That's resource allocation. No reason for people to be talking about bankruptcy when you got, you know, $8 billion of revenue and 2,000 athletes. So, and the universities are facing the same thing. It's redefining your priorities to deal with the challenges that we all currently face. In some cases, that may mean that you're going to have to scale back programs that were great 50 years ago, but maybe have been superseded in current societal significance by other needs and other programs. Every board I'm on a lot of boards. You know, usually that people say the function of a board is oversight, the function of the executive team is management, and I always add one thing. The function of a board is resource allocation. So, because everything that gets done in any organization, whether it's a company or an NGO or a university, depends upon how you allocate resources, and that's got to start at the top, and it's got to be smart. And I noticed there was an article in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago about flag football in the schools in Florida. You know, if women are fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan and playing rugby, there's no reason they can't play football. So that's my answer to that. If they want to, if they prefer to play other sports, that's fine. Will they ever, you know, play tackle football? Will they ever play professional rugby? I don't know, but all I do know is I meet a lot of women who are delighted to be playing rugby, delighting to be playing ice hockey, like Angela Ruggiero I mentioned. I spent a lot of time with her in Vancouver in February. And if people can do what the USA women's hockey team does, they can play football, and they are. So there'll be opportunities for leadership there, just like Mia Hamm and others have provided in other sports. In terms of leadership at some institutional or organizational level, I think those opportunities will come. I don't think you have to have participated in a sport to be a leader or to be an executive. In fact, when young people ask me, what should I do to have a career in sports? You know, I'm trying to get an internship with Major League Baseball or the NFL or with Nike. I usually tell them, go someplace else. Go to work for a labor union. Go to work for somebody else. Because the most valuable thing you can do is to get experience outside of sports and then bring it into sports. So I don't think you have to have played football or ice hockey to be a leader, you know, to be a woman who leads in football or ice hockey. I think you need to there's a woman here, Stephanie Streeter, is on the Packers board and was the head of the U.S. Olympic Committee for a while. I think she's a phenomenally talented executive. I don't think she was ever an Olympian. Probably was held against her by some people, but that's one of the things we need to redress. You don't have to have played sports to understand, how to lead a sports organization. It helps in some ways, but some of the most successful leaders in sports were bookworms and not athletes. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good week. I can leave that for somebody.